Freedom in Africa was never stolen overnight. It was drained quietly, like water through cracked clay. For decades, every email, every payment, every voice had to travel thousands of miles before returning home, as if neighbors in Ouagadougou had to send their letters across the Atlantic just to be heard. This was not efficiency. This was dependency wrapped in wires and algorithms. But then came a voice, young, determined, defiant. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, barely in his mid-30s, asked the forbidden question: why should Africa rent its own future from Silicon Valley? His answer was not in speeches, but in cables laid across deserts, in data centers rising from Dakar to Nairobi, in a digital road no longer controlled by distant toll keepers. The paradox is glaring. When Europe defends its sovereignty, the world applauds. When Africa demands the same, suspicion clouds the air. Yet here stands a generation that refuses chains disguised as contracts. Stay with us. This is not just about technology. It is about dignity, destiny, and the seed of freedom planted in African soil. Subscribe now and witness the story unfold. For years, Africa lived with an invisible tax, not one imposed by kings or parliaments, but by cables and clouds. Each search query from Ghana, each money transfer in Burkina Faso, each student's download in Nairobi, all of it traveled across oceans before circling back. Imagine mailing a letter to the house next door, only to watch it sail to Paris or Seattle first. That was the daily absurdity written into Africa's digital bloodstream. This structure was not an accident. It was designed. The West built the pipelines, and Africa was told to be grateful for access, no matter the cost. Families sacrificed groceries to pay for internet fees. Students waited minutes for downloads that elsewhere took seconds. A continent of 1.4 billion people, the youngest population on Earth, was trapped on rented roads owned by foreign shareholders. Dependency was not only financial, it was psychological. Search engines shaped what Africans saw about themselves. Too often, Napoleon appeared before the Mali Empire. The stories of Africa were buried under layers of someone else's narrative. Into this architecture of dependence stepped a new face. Ibrahim Traoré, the young officer who rose to lead Burkina Faso in 2022, spoke of sovereignty in terms many found unsettling. Not only sovereignty over land or gold, but sovereignty over knowledge itself. If we can reclaim our minds, our farms, and now our internet, then dependence ends, he declared. For his critics, it was rhetoric. For his supporters, it was prophecy. The vision was audacious. To build a continental internet that bypassed Silicon Valley's monopoly, Africa would need more than slogans. It required over 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cables, threading deserts and jungles alike. It meant 47 major data centers, scattered across capitals from Dakar to Nairobi, humming with the lifeblood of connectivity. It demanded a new protocol, deliberately incompatible with the indexing systems of Google and the cloud services of Microsoft. In short, Africa was not asking for a seat at the table. It was building a table of its own. The scale of the project defied belief. Western analysts dismissed it as symbolic, a gesture that would collapse under technical weight. Engineers, policymakers, and entrepreneurs across Africa knew the risks: high costs, technical challenges, the near certainty of resistance from powerful forces abroad. But they also knew the cost of silence. Another decade of dependency meant another generation robbed of opportunity. When the switch finally flipped, history turned. Within days, over 200 million Africans migrated to the new system. No platform in Silicon Valley's history, not Facebook, not WhatsApp, not TikTok, had ever seen such adoption so quickly. This was not just infrastructure. It was revolt written in fiber optics. Across Ouagadougou, Nairobi, and Lagos, the impact was immediate. Lectures streamed without interruption. Payment systems worked faster and cheaper. Farmers checked market prices without foreign detours. Journalists searched in their native languages and found African voices first. What had once been theory was now reality. A continent too often described as dependent had built its own arteries of power. Yet victory was never meant to be simple. For each cheer on social media, there was a question whispered in policy rooms. Could Africa sustain this digital independence? Could its engineers defend against external pressure and internal corruption? Would the dream of sovereignty hold, or would it fracture under the weight of expectation? And that is where the story takes its first turn. The confrontation not just with technology, but with the forces determined to stop it. The tremor began not in Ouagadougou, but in Silicon Valley. When Africa's new digital highway came alive, the algorithms of the world's most powerful companies faltered. Google's crawlers, the invisible spiders that index the internet, suddenly found doors they could not open. Microsoft's cloud, long a silent custodian of African knowledge, hit walls it could not penetrate. What had once been monopoly was now irrelevance, engineered by design. Emergency meetings followed. In boardrooms across California, executives stared at maps showing 200 million users who had migrated in days. It was not just competition, it was secession. The African system was incompatible, sovereign by architecture. For the first time, Silicon Valley's confidence cracked. Washington and Paris responded with alarm. In congressional hearings, policymakers raised the specter of digital fragmentation, framing Africa's step not as independence but as recklessness. European diplomats whispered of instability, warning that a splintered internet could undermine security, commerce, and influence. The language was familiar. Sovereignty when claimed by Europe was defense, but sovereignty when claimed by Africa was danger. Yet on the streets of Lagos, Nairobi, and Dakar, the atmosphere was electric. Hashtags like Africa Connected and Sovereignty now surged across timelines. Young Africans posted short clips celebrating faster speeds, lower costs, and a sense of dignity reclaimed. In Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight. Our data, our destiny. Students streamed lectures without interruption. Entrepreneurs saved money on transactions, and farmers accessed real-time prices that once lagged for hours. Each benefit was small in isolation, but together they became a chorus of triumph. Still, celebration was shadowed by doubt. Civil society leaders cautioned that the same tools of independence could be abused. Would governments use this newfound control to silence dissent? Would sovereignty become another word for surveillance? The promise of freedom carried the burden of responsibility. Global media framed the event as shock and rupture. Headlines in New York and London spoke of the internet breaking apart. Analysts compared the scale of adoption to nothing in history, not the rise of Facebook, not the boom of TikTok. The speed and size of Africa's leap was unprecedented. Some called it the birth of a new digital order. Others whispered the word rebellion. Inside Africa, the symbolism mattered as much as the substance. Traore's speeches, once dismissed as youthful bravado, now echoed across campuses and coffee shops. His line, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends," was repeated on posters, hashtags, and conversations in marketplaces. It was not merely policy, it was identity. A young continent, long told it was too fragmented, too underdeveloped, too dependent, had proven otherwise. Yet the questions remained heavy. Could the fragile infrastructure withstand cyber attacks, sanctions, and the immense weight of expectation? Could a generation raised on rented networks maintain their own? The more Africa celebrated, the more foreign powers prepared their counterplay. The world was watching, but the real test was only beginning. Because behind the celebration loomed the storm: pressure, resistance, and the question of whether this bold leap could survive the clash of politics and power. The revolution of fiber and code did not remain in the realm of politics or policy. It reached kitchens, classrooms, and clinics. In Ouagadougou, families who once faced the cruel choice between groceries and school internet fees now found the balance tipped in their favor. In Nairobi, students streamed lectures without interruptions that once stole hours from their studies. In Lagos, entrepreneurs rejoiced as transactions cleared in seconds without detours through foreign servers. The abstract became tangible. Sovereignty was no longer only a word, it was lived reality. The financial impact was staggering. The $50 billion once drained annually into foreign servers now circulated at home. That wealth funded engineers, seeded startups, and strengthened economies that had long been hollowed out. Each fiber laid was not just a cable, but a job created, a skill nurtured, a future secured. The cycle of dependence began to reverse. For decades, Africa exported raw materials and imported finished goods. Now even the invisible wealth of data was retained, building strength from within. Culturally, the shift was no less profound. Algorithms once tilted toward Western narratives now lifted African voices. Search results for Burkina Faso independence no longer drowned under colonial summaries, but highlighted African scholarship, oral histories, and local perspectives. For the first time, students found their own heritage without digital detours. This was not only connectivity, it was dignity restored. Politically, Ibrahim Traoré emerged as a figure larger than the presidency of Burkina Faso. His words and actions began to be spoken of as the foundation of an Ibrahim Traoré legacy. Critics called it premature, yet for many Africans, his stance marked a turning point. He had tied digital sovereignty to mining, agriculture, and national independence, weaving a fabric of resistance that resonated far beyond borders. But with recognition came responsibility. Civil society warned of the dangers of centralized power. If sovereignty meant cutting the strings of Silicon Valley, it must not mean tying citizens with new chains at home. Activists demanded transparency, insisting that infrastructure should empower, not silence. In town halls and online forums, debates flared. Would governments misuse control over data to monitor, censor, or punish? Could independence coexist with liberty? Inside Burkina Faso, the mood was both proud and restless. Citizens felt dignity in no longer paying rent to foreign powers, yet they also feared that domestic elites might hijack the gains. Parliament debated safeguards while student groups pushed for digital literacy programs to ensure that sovereignty was not reserved for the few, but shared by all. The stakes were immense. Sovereignty without accountability could turn victory into betrayal. Regionally, neighbors watched closely. Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria considered deeper integration into the new network, while others hesitated, fearing political backlash from the West. The African Union attempted to mediate, framing the continental internet exchange as not only a technological leap, but a political declaration. Unity was essential, yet unity was fragile. Beneath the optimism, the fragility of the system lingered. Servers could crash, cables could be sabotaged, and economies could buckle under sanctions. The question was no longer whether Africa could build independence, but whether it could defend it. History offered bitter lessons. Revolutions that began with fire often ended in ashes when institutions failed to sustain them. The daily lives of millions reflected both the promise and the peril. A farmer in Bobo Dioulasso celebrated fairer prices thanks to direct access to markets, yet wondered if new taxes might follow. A teacher in Dakar rejoiced in cheaper connections for her pupils, yet worried about political censorship creeping through the back door. Independence was not a destination, it was a daily test. And so, in the midst of triumph, Africa stood at a crossroads. It had built the infrastructure of sovereignty, but could it nurture the culture of freedom? Because the true measure of this revolution will not be the cables under the soil, but the choices above it. Choices that could turn victory into virtue or into vanity. The tremors of Africa's digital leap did not stop at its shores. They rippled outward, shaking boardrooms, parliaments, and newsrooms across the globe. The African Union hailed the Continental Internet Exchange as proof that the continent could act as one, not merely as a collection of nations. ECOWAS, often criticized for paralysis, declared that digital sovereignty could be the cornerstone of regional integration. For once, African institutions were not reacting to crises, they were shaping the future. In Europe, the mood was anxious. Paris and Brussels warned of a fragmented internet, framing Africa's independence as a destabilizing force. Leaders who had long spoken of sovereignty in their own contexts suddenly painted it as dangerous when exercised by Africans. Reports in London fretted about losing cultural influence in regions once dominated by colonial ties. It was a revealing double standard, a mirror of history repeating in digital form. Across the Atlantic, Washington debated strategy. Should the United States sanction, negotiate, or simply adapt? Tech CEOs lobbied for intervention, warning of lost profits and diminished influence. Yet some American voices admitted the truth. Africa had simply done what any self-respecting nation would do. Independence was only threatening when it meant the loss of control. Elsewhere, the echoes were different. In South America, leaders openly studied Africa's blueprint, asking if a continental digital network might free them from dependence on northern powers. In Asia, governments experimenting with regional systems found validation. If Africa, often dismissed as fragmented, could unite in this way, then perhaps the age of monopolies was truly ending. Global media wrestled with the narrative. Was this rebellion or renaissance? Analysts admitted no adoption curve in Silicon Valley's history matched Africa's 200 million users in days. Technology reporters described the event as the day the internet map was redrawn. The framing varied, but the fact remained: Africa was no longer a tenant on someone else's property. For Ibrahim Traoré, the implications stretched beyond immediate victory. His speeches began to frame the movement not as a single achievement, but as part of a broader horizon, what some began to call the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. In this vision, sovereignty in digital space was only the first chapter. Next would come sovereignty in agriculture, in energy, in security. A continent that once exported raw materials and imported rules would become the author of its own destiny. Yet questions lingered. Could global pressure, sanctions, disinformation, or even cyber warfare erode Africa's resolve? Would alliances fracture under strain? And perhaps most pressing, would the continent's own leaders remain faithful to the principles of transparency and dignity, or succumb to the temptations of power? Because what lies ahead is not merely a technological test, but a moral one. Whether sovereignty can be defended without repeating the sins of domination Africa once fought to escape. The revolution of Africa's internet was never meant to be the final chapter. It was the opening of a road, and every road leads somewhere. The question now is whether this path will endure or collapse under its own weight. Three futures stretch ahead. In the first, the infrastructure holds, the economies adapt, and Africa sustains its independence. Engineers refine protocols, universities train new experts, and startups blossom in cities once starved of opportunity. Under this scenario, sovereignty deepens, not only in data but across agriculture, mining, and energy. The digital victory becomes the cornerstone of a wider emancipation. In the second, the pressures prove too heavy. Sanctions cut supply chains, cyber attacks weaken networks, and political elites betray the promise of transparency. The dream falters, citizens grow disillusioned, and dependence creeps back through the cracks. The cables remain, but the spirit of freedom is lost. In the third, compromise emerges. Africa maintains its network but bends to global pressures, creating hybrid systems that blend sovereignty with cooperation. This path avoids collapse but risks diluting the message. That true independence means not just participation, but authorship. For ordinary Africans, the stakes are profound. A farmer in Mali wonders if his children will grow up connected to African-built systems or once again pay invisible tolls to distant powers. A teacher in Ghana hopes that her pupils will not only read about African history, but publish their own knowledge to the world. A young coder in Nairobi dreams of building an app that reaches millions of neighbors without needing validation from California. The symbolism endures. Each fiber laid is more than technology. It is a declaration. Each data center is more than steel. It is a promise. Each login is more than convenience. It is a vote for dignity. But dignity alone does not guarantee endurance. Sovereignty is not a static possession. It is a discipline, renewed each day in choices of governance, investment, and solidarity. Traore's message struck chords because it was both simple and demanding. Independence begins the moment you refuse to wait for permission. Yet independence survives only when defended with wisdom, patience, and justice. Africa stands at a threshold. One path leads to permanence, another to betrayal, a third to compromise. Which path it chooses will echo not only in Ouagadougou or Lagos, but in the corridors of Washington, Brussels, and Beijing. And so the question remains, will this seed of sovereignty grow into a forest of freedom, or will it wither under the weight of the world? Africa's story has always been written in cycles: exploitation, resistance, rebirth. For centuries, wealth flowed outward: gold, cotton, cocoa, oil. Even the invisible wealth of data was siphoned away, leaving the continent dependent on foreign gates. But with the rise of a continental internet, that flow began to reverse. Knowledge, money, and opportunity now circulate inward, building resilience where there was fragility, dignity where there was dependency. At the heart of this shift stands a young leader, Ibrahim Traoré. His words once seemed like defiance, but now they are etched into cables and servers across the continent. His call to reclaim not only land but also knowledge has become more than rhetoric. It has become a lived reality. For millions, this is the beginning of an Ibrahim Traoré legacy. A legacy not of speeches, but of infrastructure, not of slogans, but of sovereignty made visible. And yet legacy is not secured by one generation alone. The burden now rests on the shoulders of Africans to nurture what has been built, to guard it against corruption within and pressure from without. The dream stretches beyond the present moment into a horizon some call the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. In that vision lies the promise of an Africa that does not merely participate in the global order, but reshapes it, sovereign in data, strong in economy, and united in purpose. The world is watching. To some, Africa's digital independence is a threat. To others, it is a beacon. But perhaps the truth is simpler. It is justice long delayed. Sovereignty should never be feared when it brings dignity to people long denied their share of power. The question that remains is for all of us. Not only for Africa, will we accept a world where freedom is rented, or will we choose one where it is owned? If this story moved you, let it not end here. Share it, speak of it, carry it further than any cable. Subscribe now and walk with us, because the seed planted today could grow into the forest of tomorrow.